Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling something huge, something that's fascinated people for, well, millennia,
We really are. We're diving deep into the Philosopher's Stone.
right? The Philosopher's Stone.
Mhm.
That name alone conjures up, wizards and ancient labs.
It does. And it obsessed, truly obsessed, scientists, mystics, kings, artisans for thousands of years. But it's more than just turning lead into gold, which is what most people think of first.
Yeah, that one image is so powerful, isn't it? The Chrysopia, is that the term? Turning base metals into pure gold?
That's the one. And it's definitely, the most famous part of the whole legend, a huge driver.
But looking at the sources, the things you've pulled together for this deep dive, it feels like that's just scratching the surface. Like the shiny, obvious bit, the stone was meant to be something more, like the ultimate symbol of perfection.
Exactly. And that's really our mission today, I think. To try and trace the complete story, we need to explore all the different theories, the different angles, and even ask, was any of it real? Could it be real? Because when you really dig into the text, the stone, it wasn't defined by just one ability. There were two main incredible claims. First, yes, that transmutation we mentioned, making gold or sometimes silver.
Right, the physical wealth aspect.
For physical wealth.
Yeah.
But second, and this is crucial, often the alchemists themselves saw this as the greater achievement, the more sort of divine miracle.
Ah, this must be the elixir of life, the elixir vitae.
Precisely that, the elixir of life. Imagine a universal panacea, something that could not just cure every disease known.
Which is already incredible.
Right, but also grant physical rejuvenation, make you young again, confer effectively indefinite immortality, eternal youth.
Wow, so the stone wasn't just a chemical agent. It was like everything. Divine insight, total mastery over matter, eternal life,
Yeah.
all rolled into one substance.
That's the idea, the absolute pinnacle of achievement, heavenly bliss in tangible form almost.
So, okay, let's unpack that for everyone listening. We're not just chasing some, forgotten chemical recipe here. This is about the ultimate symbol of perfection.
Mm-hmm.
And the big challenge, it seems, is that what perfection meant? Well, it kept changing, didn't it? The definition wasn't fixed.
That's one of the most fascinating things about it. The stone was what you might call a floating signifier. Its meaning, its purpose, its very definition shifted, depending entirely on who was looking for it.
How so? Give us some examples.
Well, if you were, say, a practical metallurgist in medieval Europe, your focus might be almost entirely on the Chrysopia, making gold. That's the bottom line.
Okay, the money.
The money, the power. But if you were a Taoist practitioner in China, the gold might be secondary. The real prize, the only goal sometimes, was the elixir of immortality.
Right, different priorities entirely.
Completely. Then you have figures like Zosimos, an early Gnostic mystic, or much, much later, someone like Carl Jung in the 20th century.
The psychologist.
Yes. For them, whether the stone physically existed was almost beside the point. Its primary value was as a metaphor, a symbol for spiritual purification, for psychological integration.
So to really understand the Philosopher's Stone, we have to follow how this definition twisted and turned as it moved through different cultures, different intellectual eras.
That's the only way. We have to trace its evolution.
Okay, so let's start with the basics then. If it wasn't always just a stone, what did they actually think they were making in those labs? I think that name, Philosopher's Stone, it's maybe the first hurdle. Because when you actually read the alchemical texts, the practical ones, the symbolic ones, the final product, it's almost never described as just a rock, is it?
No, you're absolutely right. The name stone is pretty misleading. The descriptions of the perfected substance, they vary quite a bit. Very often, the texts talk about it as a fine, heavy powder.
A powder.
Yes. They often called it the tincture, or sometimes just the red powder. Some descriptions even get stranger, calling it a kind of magical dust, or even like a special type of dirt you could find anywhere.
Huh. Dirt. Okay. And it wasn't just one thing either, right? There were sort of levels to it, grades of success.
Yes, exactly. Success wasn't necessarily all or nothing. It was often marked by color, which led to this symbolism of the two lions. The first major milestone was achieving the white lion.
The white lion.
This was usually described as a white stone or a white powder. It represented the lesser magnitude, as they called it. This white tincture, it was believed, could turn base metals into silver.
Silver. Okay. Still valuable, but not the ultimate goal.
Not the ultimate prize, no. Silver was considered the lesser noble metal, sort of pure but not perfect. The true goal, the absolute end product, that was always the red lion.
The red lion, that sounds more potent.
Immensely more potent. This was usually described as a dense red powder or maybe a ruby-like crystal. It represented the highest grade of perfection. This was the agent that could achieve the perfect transmutation, turning lead or whatever you started with into pure gold.
And presumably this red lion was also the key to the elixir of life.
Absolutely. It was the red form that was believed to contain the power to create the full elixir, the one granting health and immortality. Which is why, you see, it was considered infinitely more valuable than just making silver or even just making gold. It was about conquering death itself.
So this red lion, it really represents power far beyond just making you rich. I mean, the range of other powers they attributed to it, it's kind of mind-boggling. It feels like they were projecting all human hopes onto this one substance.
The list is quite astonishing, yes. And it really shows its function as this absolute symbol of perfection, of mastering nature. Besides wealth and immortality, you find texts claiming the stone could create lamps that burn forever without fuel.
Perpetually burning lamps.
It could supposedly revive dead plants, instantly transform ordinary crystals into diamonds, or even create flexible, malleable glass.
Flexible glass. That's such a specific, weird detail. It sounds like something out of science fiction. Does a claim like that suggest they were just, exaggerating to get funding from a king? Or were these actual, if maybe misguided, experimental goals?
It's probably a bit of both. Claims like malleable glass.
Yeah.
Well, maybe they stemmed from real experiments that didn't quite work but got, let's say, embellished in the telling. Or maybe they were purely aspirational.
And then there's the really wild stuff, like creating life.
Yes, the idea of artificially creating a clone or a homunculus, a tiny artificial human, claims like that really cemented the stone as this almost divine agent, capable of bending or even breaking the laws of nature. It wasn't just about getting rich, it was about achieving a kind of power that put you on par with the creator.
Which brings us right back to what you said earlier about the stone being a floating signifier. Its definition just stretched to fit whatever the seeker's ultimate goal was.
Precisely. Wealth, health, divine knowledge, self-mastery. The stone became the vessel for all of it.
So if you were someone like Paracelsus, the medical reformer.
Right. For Paracelsus, the iatrochemist, the stone had to be, first and foremost, the ultimate panacea, the universal medicine. That was its highest purpose in his view.
Whereas for an ancient mystic like Zosimos,
the physical powder, well, it might have been interesting, but it was secondary. The real work, the real stone, was the purified soul it represented. The physical quest and the spiritual quest were always intertwined, two sides of the same hermetic coin, you could say.
Okay, so if you're going to make something that powerful, curing disease, making gold, maybe even creating life, you need a starting point that's equally extraordinary. Which brings us to, well, the first massive puzzle of the great work, the magnum opus, finding the prima materia, the first matter.
The prima materia, yes, this is the absolute foundation, theoretically. It's conceived as the original, primitive, formless base from which all matter originates. Think of it like the classical idea of chaos, or maybe the quintessence, the fifth element. It's the raw, undifferentiated stuff of the universe.
So the idea was, before you could impose the perfect form like gold, you had to first get rid of the imperfect form, like lead. You had to break it right back down to this original stuff.
Exactly. You had to strip away the existing structure, dissolve the identity of the substance, and reduce it back to its potential, its primordial state.
But if this prima materia is the basis of everything, why was it so hard to find? This seems like the big paradox, right? The paradox of ubiquity.
That's it, precisely. It exists everywhere. It's in everything. The alchemists would say you walk on it, you breathe it, you carry it within you, yet it's invisible. It's inaccessible to the profane, the uninitiated.
Hiding in plain sight.
Hiding in plain sight, that's the classic phrase. The simultaneous commonness and hiddenness, that's what defines it. They were trying to isolate a substance that was, in essence, all substances. It had no form of its own, but contain the potential for all forms.
And because it was supposedly everywhere and nowhere, formless yet potent, they gave it tons of different names, right? The texts seem almost deliberately confusing on this point.
Oh, absolutely deliberately confusing. That intentional ambiguity, the multiplication of names, it served a couple of key purposes. First, and maybe most obviously, it was about concealing the arcanum, the great secret, from the unworthy.
Keeping it out of the wrong hands.
Right. They believed this knowledge was incredibly powerful and potentially dangerous. Second, it was a kind of defense mechanism. If accused of doing something illicit like counterfeiting gold or heresy, they could always claim they were speaking allegorically about spiritual matters, not literal chemistry.
I saw one list, I think, from Rule and the Younger's dictionary. It had dozens of synonyms: lead, mercury, vinegar, earth, fire, blood, the sea, the mother, and some really evocative ones like the dragon.
Ah, yes, the dragon or the serpent, often shown eating its own tail, the Ouroboros. That's a really key image for the prima materia.
Why the dragon?
It symbolizes that raw, untamed, volatile, chaotic state of matter. It's consuming itself and regenerating itself, this endless cycle. The alchemist's first major task was to capture and tame that dragon or conquer it, to render the volatile fixed.
So taking something common like lead, which they often saw as the sickest or most impure metal, and forcing it back into this original chaotic dragon state.
That's the core idea of the initial stage. You have to dissolve the structure, return to the beginning, embrace the chaos before you can build anew.
And this is where the whole process really jumps from just being about chemicals in a flask to being about the alchemists themselves, isn't it?
Yeah.
That connection seems vital for its later significance.
It really is, because when Carl Jung looked back at all this centuries later, he saw this process as a powerful projection of an inner psychological reality.
How so?
He saw the prima materia as a metaphor for our own unintegrated inner chaos, the raw, unconscious psychic material that we all carry within us, often unacknowledged. The very first step towards psychological growth, towards wholeness, Jung argued, is confronting that chaos, breaking down your existing ego structure, facing the unknown within yourself.
Okay, so you found your prima materia, theoretically at least, or you've reduced your starting metal back to it. Now you need a plan, a recipe to build it back up into perfection, into gold. This leads us to the dominant theory of matter for centuries, right? The sulfur-mercury theory.
Yes, the sulfur-mercury theory. This model was absolutely central, especially after being codified in the works attributed to Jabir ibn Hayyan, or Gibber, during the Islamic Golden Age. It basically explained how transmutation could even be possible.
And the core idea was that all metals are made of just two basic components.
Two fundamental principles, yes. And it's really important, as you hinted, to stress these were philosophical principles, not literally the elements sulfur and mercury that we know from the periodic table, though chemists often use the actual elements as stand-ins or starting points.
Okay, so philosophical sulfur and philosophical mercury, what did they represent?
Philosophical sulfur was seen as the active principle. It was fiery, combustible, assertive, you could say masculine. It was thought to impart color, fixity, and structure to a substance.
And mercury.
Philosophical mercury was the passive principle. It was watery, fluid, receptive, fusible, considered feminine. It imparted malleability, volatility, and shininess.
So the difference between lead and gold wasn't that they were fundamentally different substances, but more like different mixtures, different ratios and purities of these two principles.
Exactly that. Gold was considered the perfect metal because it supposedly contained the purest, most subtle forms of both sulfur and mercury, combined in a perfectly balanced, mature ratio.
And lead.
Lead, being dark, heavy, easily tarnished, was seen as immature or maybe sick. It had an imbalanced ratio, or its sulfur and mercury components were impure, corrupted somehow.
So transmutation wasn't magic, it was more like medicine, healing the metal.
That's a great way to put it. It was seen as a process of cosmic healing, a rectification. The philosopher's stone, or the elixir, the Arabic word elixir, literally means the medicine, was conceived as this incredibly potent agent that could purge the impurities from the base metal and adjust the sulfur-mercury ratio until it reached the perfect harmony of gold.
That idea of cosmic healing is really powerful. But the theory didn't stop there, did it? It evolved, particularly with Paracelsus in the 16th century. He added a third principle.
He did. Paracelsus, the big medical revolutionary we mentioned, felt that two principles weren't enough to explain everything, especially the complexities of the human body and disease. So he expanded the theory into the tree prima, the three principles, by adding salt.
Salt. Okay, so now we have sulfur, mercury, and salt. What does salt represent in his system?
Salt represented the principle of the body. It stood for fixity, solidity, the tangible material substance that remains after burning, the ash. So, in his expanded framework, mercury was the spirit volatile, the life force, the mind. Sulfur was the soul, fiery, oily, the emotional aspect. And salt was the body, the fixed physical structure.
And adding salt was the key to shifting the focus of alchemy towards medicine.
Absolutely crucial, because now Paracelsus had a framework to explain illness in purely chemical terms. Sickness, he argued, was simply an imbalance, a disharmony of these three principles within the human body.
So if illness is a chemical problem,
Then the cure must be a chemical remedy. This was his radical departure. Instead of just relying on herbs, he advocated using specific, potent chemical preparations, often derived from metals and minerals like lead, mercury, antimony, arsenic, to restore the balance of sulfur, mercury, and salt in the body. This is the birth of iatrochemistry, and really the foundation of modern pharmacology and toxicology.
okay, so we have the starting point, the prima materia. We have the theoretical recipe, sulfur and mercury, maybe salt. But what about the actual doing, the process itself? This seemed to be captured in that famous Latin phrase, solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate.
Yes, solve et coagula. That's the heartbeat of the entire operation, the fundamental rhythm of the great work. It represents this continuous cycle, breaking down what is fixed and then solidifying what is volatile, aiming for a higher, more purified state each time.
It's like cycle of death and rebirth applied to matter.
Exactly. Let's look at the first part. Solve.
Dissolve.
Solve means to dissolve, to decompose, to putrefy. This is the stage of breaking down the fixed body, whether that's the metal in your crucible or maybe your own ingrained habits and ego, reducing it back towards that initial chaotic, volatile state, back towards the prima materia.
How would they do that physically?
Physically, it often involved intense heat, calcination, or using powerful corrosive agents, acids like that aqua regia we talked about, to literally dissolve the substance. Symbolically, it represents destruction, death, confronting darkness.
And then after the breaking down comes the rebuilding, coagula.
Coagulate. This is the process of reconstitution, taking the purified essence, the volatile spirit that's been released, and capturing it, making it fixed again, solidifying it into a new, stable, and hopefully more perfect form.
So creation, rebirth.
Precisely. The emergence of the new from the ashes of the old.
And it feels really clear, listening to this, that this whole solve et coagula process wasn't just something happening in the glassware. The alchemist was meant to be part of it, right? Experiencing it themselves.
That simultaneity is absolutely fundamental to understanding why the stone and the whole process held such deep meaning for so long. The laboratory, the chemical theater, as it was sometimes called, was a mirror.
A mirror for what?
For the alchemists' own inner transformation. They believed they were mimicking the divine process of creation. To succeed, they couldn't just manipulate matter, they had to purify themselves. They had to dissolve their own ignorance, their attachments, their ego, before they could reform themselves into a more illuminated, integrated being.
So solve et coagula wasn't just a lab instruction, it was like a spiritual mandate.
It absolutely was. A mandate for inner work, where the chemistry was the outward reflection, or maybe even the catalyst for a profound personal transformation.
Okay, this great work, the magnum opus, it wasn't a quick process, was it? We're talking years, potentially decades of patient work.
Oh, absolutely. Immense patience, meticulous attention to detail, and a lot of failure. It was notoriously difficult. So the alchemists needed guideposts, ways to know if they were on the right track.
And they found those in the colors appearing in the flask.
Exactly. The progression of specific colors appearing within the sealed vessel, the ves hermeticum, the hermetic vessel, were seen as the key signposts. The four gates, you could call them. They signaled both the physical changes happening to the matter and, importantly, corresponding spiritual milestones for the alchemist.
Let's go through them. What was the first stage?
The first, and often described as the most difficult and terrifying, was nigredo, the blackening.
Blackness, putrefaction, chaos. I think the symbol was often a raven.
Yes, the raven or sometimes a skull. This stage corresponds directly to that initial solve operation we just discussed. It's the breaking down, the reduction to chaos. The starting material is essentially destroyed, cooked down, putrefied into a black, seemingly lifeless mass.
And spiritually?
Spiritually, this is the dark night of the soul. It's confronting your own shadow, your inner darkness, the parts of yourself you don't want to see. It's the necessary death of the old self, the dissolution of the unexamined life. Deeply challenging, often involving psychological distress.
Okay, so if the alchemist manages to get through the terrifying blackening, what comes next?
If they navigate nigredo successfully, they move into albedo, the whitening.
Whitening. Purification, cleansing. The symbol here is often a white swan, right?
That's right, the white swan or sometimes a white dove. Albedo is all about purification. The black, chaotic matter from Negrito is washed, cleansed, often through processes like distillation or sublimation, where impurities are separated out. What emerges is a pure white substance, sometimes called the white stone or white lion we mentioned earlier.
And the spiritual parallel.
This represents the purification of the soul. It's the first major step of coagula, where consciousness starts to gain clarity, insight emerges from the darkness. The soul is washed clean, ready for the next stage of integration.
Now, I remember reading about an intermediate stage, sometimes yellow, citrinitas.
Yes, citrinitas, the yellowing. This stage symbolized the dawning of the light, like the sunrise after the white purification. It represented the emergence of the solar consciousness, a growing awareness and wisdom. However, interestingly, after about the 15th century, this stage tended to get compressed or absorbed into the final stage in many Western descriptions.
Fine with that.
It's not entirely clear, but some scholars think the focus shifted more heavily onto the final ultimate achievement. So once the purification of albedo was achieved and the conjunction or sacred marriage of the purified principles occurred, often associated with citrinitas, the work was seen to proceed directly to the grand finale. Rubedo. Rubedating. This is the final perfection, symbolized by the phoenix rising from the ashes, or the red line. This is the culmination. Perfection, unity, transcendence. The matter in the vessel achieves its highest state of fixity and potency, signified by this deep, powerful red color. This is the stage where the stone, often through further processes described as fermentation and multiplication, gains its incredible power, the ability to transmute vast quantities of base metal or to create the elixir of life.
It's the successful creation of that red lion powder we talked about.
Exactly, the goal achieved.
And there was one other visual phenomenon mentioned, this beautiful-sounding thing called the cauda pavonis, the peacock's tail.
Ah, yes, the peacock's tail. This is a fascinating detail that gives us a glimpse into the actual lab work. The cauda pavonis wasn't usually considered one of the main stages, but rather a transitional phase, often appearing between Negredo and Albedo.
What was it?
It was described as the stunning, shimmering iridescence, a brief display of all the colors of the rainbow appearing in the flask. Chemically, it likely corresponded to the condensation and separation of various volatile compounds during the heating process.
But symbolically?
Symbolically, it was seen as a very positive sign. It meant that the initial chaos of Negredo had been successfully navigated, the prima materia was fully active and released, and the process of purification and reordering towards albedo was beginning. It was like a promise of the beauty and perfection to come. Hashtag tag 2.2, the foundational myths and Greco-Egyptian roots.
So much of Western alchemy seems to trace its authority back to one incredibly cryptic, incredibly short text, the Emerald Tablet, attributed to the legendary figure Hermes Trismegistus.
The Emerald Tablet is absolutely central. It's treated almost like the sacred scripture of alchemy. Despite being only a dozen or so lines long, alchemists believed it contained the entire secret of the great work, encoded in dense, allegorical language. Its obscurity, of course, just fueled centuries of interpretation and commentary.
And its most famous line, one everyone quotes, is, "That which is below corresponds to that which is above."
And that which is above corresponds to that which is below, often summarized as above, so below. This axiom established the core Hermetic principle of correspondence.
What does that mean exactly? Correspondence.
It means the universe operates on multiple levels. The macrocosm, the cosmos, the divine, and the microcosm, the earth, the laboratory, the human body. But they are all reflections of each other, governed by the same fundamental laws. So, by understanding the processes happening in your flask below, you could gain insight into the workings of the heavens or the mind of God above, and vice versa. It connected everything.
It gave their lab work cosmic significance.
Precisely. But to protect this potentially controversial knowledge and maybe give themselves some legitimacy, alchemists constructed this amazing backstory, this invented tradition, claiming their art had divine origins.
How did that work?
Well, it was quite clever, really. A brilliant bit of PR and a crucial survival tactic. They argued that Adam, the first man, was actually the first alchemist, having received the secret knowledge of the stone directly from God in the Garden of Eden.
Adam.
And this secret knowledge was then passed down through a hidden lineage of biblical patriarchs, explaining, they argued, the incredible longevity of figures like Methuselah. They supposedly lived so long because they possessed the elixir of life made using the stone.
Ah, so the Bible itself contained coded alchemical secrets.
That was the claim. And by linking the art to figures like Moses, Solomon, claiming the secrets were used to build his temple, they gave themselves this unimpeachable sacred pedigree. It was vital armor against accusations of heresy or witchcraft from the church or secular rulers.
So the myths trace it back to the very beginning, to Genesis. But historically, where does Western alchemy actually emerge? Where's the real starting point?
The historical consensus points pretty clearly to Greco-Roman Egypt, particularly the vibrant intellectual melting pot of Alexandria, around the 3rd century AD, say 300 AD or so. This is the real Alexandrian crucible where the key elements fuse together.
And right from the start in Alexandria, we see that dual nature you mentioned earlier, the practical and the spiritual sides.
Yes, the evidence suggests they emerged together, almost simultaneously. On one hand, you have the esoteric or mystical tradition. The key figure here is Zosimos of Panopolis, who is one of the earliest alchemists whose writings partially survive.
And Zosimos was more focused on the spiritual side.
Very much so. He was influenced by Gnosticism and saw the alchemical process primarily as a spiritual journey, a path to enlightenment. He actually referred to the alchemical vessel as a baptismal font. For him, the goal wasn't really making physical gold, but purifying the divine spark, the spirit, which he believed was trapped within matter and, by extension, trapped within the alchemist's own soul.
Okay, so that's the mystical wing. What about the practical hands-on side?
That's the exoteric tradition. This is represented by texts like the Physica Kai Mystica, meaning on physical and mystical things, which was attributed, probably falsely, to the ancient Greek philosopher Democritus.
And this text was more like a recipe book.
Essentially, yes. It reads much more like a practical manual for artisans. It contained recipes and techniques for things like dyeing base metals to make them look like gold or silver, essentially, sophisticated metallurgy, and perhaps even forgery. It also included methods for faking gemstones and creating vibrant dyes for fabrics, high-level craft knowledge.
So the key takeaway here for our deep dive is that these two strands, the spiritual Gnostic philosophy of someone like Zosimos and the practical workshop craft described in Physica Kai Mystica, they weren't sequential. They were born together in Alexandria.
That seems to be the case. They weren't separate paths initially. They were intertwined aspects of the same pursuit. Trying to understand and manipulate matter involved both understanding its hidden spiritual nature and developing practical techniques. This inherent duality, part laboratory science, part spiritual discipline, is really what defines the Western alchemical tradition and helps explain why the idea of the stone has remained so compelling for so long.
Okay, so alchemy is born in this Greco-Egyptian soup. But then after the Western Roman Empire collapses, a lot of that classical knowledge risks being lost in Europe. Where does it go?
It finds refuge and indeed flourishes in the Islamic world. During the Islamic Golden Age, roughly from the 8th to the 13th centuries, scholars actively sought out, translated, and preserved Greek and Syriac texts, including the Alexandrian alchemical writings.
So they were like librarians, saving the knowledge.
They were much more than that. They didn't just preserve it, they critically engaged with it, tested it, refined it, and significantly advanced the field. They introduced a level of experimental rigor and systematic thinking that wasn't always present in the earlier Greek texts.
And the big name that always comes up here is Jabir ibn Hayyan, or Geber in Latin, often called the father of chemistry.
Yes, Jabir, or the corpus of writings attributed to him, is foundational. Whether Jabir was a single person or a school of thought is debated, but the influence is undeniable. And a key reason for that influence was this radical insistence on the importance of practical experimentation.
He really pushed the empirical method.
Absolutely. There's a famous quote attributed to him that basically says, "The first essential is that you should perform practical work and conduct experiments. For he who does not perform practical work nor makes experiments will never attain to the least degree of mastery." That's the scientific method. In essence, centuries before the European scientific revolution.
So what specific advances came out of the Jabirian school?
Well, theoretically, they systematically codified the sulfur-mercury theory, providing that core explanatory framework we discussed. But practically, they were masters of the lab. They refined apparatus like the alembic for distillation, developed sophisticated techniques like crystallization and sublimation, and were able to isolate and describe various chemical substances with unprecedented clarity.
Moving beyond just theory and speculation.
Definitely. And this drive towards experimentalism was pushed even further by figures like Abu Bakr al-Razi, known in the West as Rhazes, who lived in the late 9th and early 10th centuries.
What was al-Razi's contribution?
Al-Razi was a brilliant Persian physician and alchemist who took a very pragmatic approach. He tended to dismiss magic, talismans, and overly mystical interpretations, focusing instead on repeatable laboratory procedures. His books, like Kitab al-Azara, the Book of Secrets, are incredibly detailed. They read like systematic laboratory manuals.
How so?
He carefully classified substances based on their origins: mineral, vegetable, animal. He described the apparatus needed: alembics, crucibles, flasks, beakers, bellows, and detailed specific chemical processes. It's really the groundwork for systematic chemistry and material science. He tried to make alchemy a practical, verifiable science.
So by the time European scholars started translating these Arabic works back into Latin, starting around the 12th century, they weren't just getting dusty old Greek ideas. They were inheriting a much more advanced, experimentally grounded tradition.
That's right. A tradition rich in practical techniques and chemical knowledge. However, this process of translation and transmission also led to some confusion, notably the so-called Geber problem.
The Geber problem.
Yeah. Well, the original Geber became such a huge authority in Europe based on the early translations. So much so that later, in the 13th or 14th century, a European alchemist, probably Spanish, started writing new texts under Geber's name. We now call this author Pseudo-Geber.
Ah, so passing off his own work as the famous masters.
Exactly. And the interesting thing is these Pseudo-Geber texts were often even more practical and less philosophical than the original Arabic works attributed to Geber. They were very focused, hands-on guides.
And these forged texts became important.
Critically important, especially for the development of practical chemistry in Europe, because Pseudo-Geber's writings provided clear, actionable instructions for preparing something alchemists had struggled with: strong mineral acids.
Like sulfuric acid, nitric acid.
Precisely, and most crucially, aqua regia, the royal water, a mixture of nitric and hydrochloric acids. Why was it called royal water? Because it was the only substance known that could dissolve gold, the king of metals.
Wow, so having aqua regia was a game changer for the sol stage, for breaking down metals.
A massive game changer. It gave European alchemists a powerful chemical tool to dissolve metals without necessarily needing intense, prolonged heat. It dramatically advanced their ability to manipulate matter and further blurred that line between traditional alchemy and the emerging field of chemistry.
While all this is happening in the West, stemming from Egypt and flowing through the Islamic world to Europe, there's a whole other independent tradition developing in China, right? Rooted in Taoism.
Yes, a completely separate, but in some ways parallel, alchemical tradition flourished in China. And it's fascinating because while it shared the goal of transformation, its primary focus was quite different from the Western obsession with gold.
What was the main goal in Chinese alchemy?
Overwhelmingly, the central quest was for physical immortality, creating an elixir of life that could grant longevity, perhaps even eternal life and transcendence, becoming an immortal, a Kulsian.
So gold wasn't the main prize.
Gold was certainly valued, but more for its symbolic properties than for wealth. Because gold doesn't rust or corrode, it was seen as an immortal substance itself. Therefore, it seemed logical that it would be a key ingredient in an elixir designed to make the human body immortal, incorruptible. But the elixir was the goal, not the gold itself.
And within Chinese alchemy, there were also different approaches, weren't there? Weiden and Neiden.
That's right. Two main paths emerged. The older form is Weiden, which translates roughly as external alchemy.
External meaning laboratory-based.
Exactly. Weiden involved working with physical substances in a laboratory setting, using furnaces, crucibles, just like Western alchemists. They compounded elixirs from minerals and metals, often highly toxic ones like mercury, cinnabar, mercury sulfide, lead, and arsenic compounds.
Why use toxic substances?
The logic, somewhat paradoxically, was that these potent active substances held the key to transformation. They believed that by carefully processing and ingesting these powerful mineral essences, they could transmute the perishable human body into something fixed, stable, and immortal.
Did it work?
Well, therein lies the problem. The historical record is quite clear that Weiden had a rather deadly track record.
Oh.
Yes, famously, several powerful emperors of the Tang dynasty, desperate to achieve immortality, are recorded as having died specifically from poisoning after ingesting these mineral elixirs prepared by their court alchemists.
Yikes. Not exactly proof of concept.
Not at all. These very public, catastrophic failures led to a significant decline in the prestige and practice of Weiden. People started thinking maybe ingesting heavy metals isn't the best path to eternal life.
Which naturally led to a different approach.
It necessitated a profound shift in thinking, which gave rise to the much more sophisticated and enduring tradition of Niden, or internal alchemy.
Internal alchemy, so turning the focus inward.
Precisely. In Niden, the alchemist stops searching for the elixir in external physical substances. Instead, the human body itself becomes the laboratory. The body is the crucible, the furnace, the vessel.
How does that work? What are they doing?
Niden is a complex system of physiological and meditative practices. It involves breath control, specific postures, mental visualizations, sometimes dietary regimens, and harnessing and circulating the body's vital energies. The goal is no longer to compound a physical elixir to ingest, but to synthesize the golden elixir Jinden internally, within oneself.
And how is this internal golden elixir created?
It's created by cultivating and refining what the Taoists call the three treasures. Jing, which is usually translated as essence, sort of the fundamental generative energy. Qi, the vital life force energy that animates the body. And Shin, which is spirit or consciousness. Through disciplined practice, these three are purified, fused, and transformed within the body, leading to health, longevity, and ultimately spiritual liberation or immortality.
That's actually incredible. It sounds remarkably similar conceptually to what you said about Zosimo seeing alchemy as purifying the spirit within matter, or Jung seeing it as psychological integration.
It's a stunning example of philosophical convergence, isn't it? Developed completely independently, this Eastern path arrived at essentially the same profound insight: that the real great work, the true alchemy, is internal. It's a technology of the self.
So when the external material path, Whedon, proved dangerous or maybe just impossible?
The focus shifted inward. The Chinese tradition, like the later Western esoteric streams, realized that the language of metallurgy refining base metals, achieving incorruptibility, was ultimately a powerful metaphor for refining the human being, transforming base mortality into spiritual gold, into transcendence.
Okay, let's bring the story back to Europe. As this knowledge, both the practical Islamic chemistry and the older mystical ideas, floods back in, the Renaissance becomes this, well, golden age for alchemy, producing some of its most famous figures and legends, like Nicholas Flamel.
Flamel. He's
Right.
probably the most famous name associated with actually succeeding in making the stone, at least in legend. But the gap between the historical Flamel and the mythical figure is pretty vast.
What was the real story?
The historical Nicholas Flamel was a real person, living in Paris in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. He was a successful scribe, a bookseller, a notary. He became quite wealthy, likely through shrewd property investments and marrying a wealthy widow. He was known as a philanthropist, endowing churches and hostels. And he definitely died and was buried in Paris in 1418. We have the records.
Okay, so a successful, pious businessman. How did he become the immortal alchemist legend?
That legend seems to have emerged much later, centuries after his death, maybe in the 17th century. Stories started circulating that his wealth wasn't from business, but from discovering the secret of the stone, possibly through deciphering a mysterious ancient book, often called the Book of Abraham the Jew.
And the story grew from there.
It snowballed. He supposedly achieved transmutation, became immensely wealthy, and then, the crucial part, he and his wife Perenelle used the elixir of life to fake their own deaths and achieve immortality. That's the archetype, the ultimate adept who got it all: wealth, knowledge, eternal life.
Which is why he pops up in things like Harry Potter, right?
Yeah.
He embodies that literal interpretation of the stone's promise.
Exactly. He's the poster child for it actually worked. But perhaps the most impactful figure from this Renaissance period in terms of real-world consequences was that physician we keep mentioning, Paracelsus.
Right, the guy who said alchemy wasn't about gold, it was about medicine.
Paracelsus was a force of nature. Arrogant, outspoken, revolutionary, he publicly burned the established medical texts of his day. He essentially hijacked the alchemical tradition, declaring its true purpose, its highest calling, was to prepare effective medicines. He founded iatrochemistry, chemical medicine.
And how did this fundamentally change medicine? We touched on it with the Tria Prima.
By framing illness as a chemical imbalance of sulfur, mercury, and salt in the body, he justified treating diseases not just with herbs and bloodletting, but with specific, potent chemical remedies. He introduced compounds of mercury, lead, antimony, arsenic, iron into the pharmacopoeia. It was radical, often dangerous, but it forced medicine to start thinking chemically.
And that famous saying of his, the dose makes the poison.
Sola dosis facit venenum. Only the dose makes the poison. That's his most enduring legacy, arguably. It's the foundational principle of toxicology and pharmacology. He recognized that substances weren't inherently good or bad. Their effect depended entirely on the quantity and preparation. A tiny amount of a poison could be a medicine, and too much of a medicine could be a poison. That insight underpins all modern drug development and dosage calculations.
It's amazing how much modern science owes to these figures. And it wasn't just Paracelsus, right? Other major Renaissance intellectuals were deeply involved in alchemy, even alongside what we now call science or magic, like John Dee.
Oh, absolutely. John Dee is a perfect example of how integrated these fields were for the Renaissance mind. He was Queen Elizabeth I's trusted advisor, a brilliant mathematician, astronomer, navigator, and a devoted alchemist and magician.
He was the one communicating with angels, right?
Yes. Dee, along with this controversial scryer, or medium, Edward Kelly, developed this complex system of Enochian magic, supposedly based on communications with angels received through a crystal ball or shoe stone. And Dee absolutely believed these angelic communications could reveal secrets of nature, including the formula for the Philosopher's Stone.
So he was trying to get the recipe directly from angels.
That seems to have been part of the project, yes. For Dee, mathematics, astronomy, alchemy, angelic magic, it wasn't separate disciplines like we see them now. It was all part of one unified quest for divine knowledge, for understanding the hidden structure of God's creation. The Hermetic philosophy embraced it all.
This era also saw the creation of those incredibly beautiful, purely symbolic alchemical texts, like the Mutus Liber, the silent book.
God, the Mutus Liber. Published in 1677, so a bit later, but firmly in that esoteric tradition. It's a masterpiece of allegorical communication. It contains almost no written words, just 15 intricate engravings.
No words at all. How did it convey anything?
Purely through images. The plates depict a couple, representing the alchemist and his sor mystica, or mystical sister wife, carrying out the stages of the great work. You see images symbolizing the collection of dew, often seen as a source of prima materia, distillation, calcination, the conjunction of male and female principles, sun and moon, the stages of blackening, whitening, reddening. It's a visual guide to the magnum opus.
But completely impenetrable unless you already knew the symbolic language.
Exactly. It was a silent book, mute to the uninitiated, but speaking volumes to those who understood the allegories. It's a perfect example of how the spiritual, esoteric wing of alchemy continued, often going underground or becoming more coded, even as the scientific revolution began to dawn.
And that brings us to maybe the most fascinating paradoxical figure in this whole story, Mr. Isaac Newton, the icon of the scientific revolution, the father of classical physics, yet secretly obsessed with alchemy.
It's one of the great revelations of 20th century historical scholarship, really. When Newton's private papers were examined, they found he had written over 1 million words on alchemy. That's far more than he wrote on physics or optics or mathematics combined.
1 million words. This wasn't just a passing hobby then.
Not remotely. This was a deep, driving intellectual passion that consumed him for decades, particularly during his most productive years at Cambridge. He conducted countless experiments in secret in his own laboratory.
What was he actually looking for? Was he trying to make gold?
Making gold might have been part of it, maybe as proof of concept, but Newton's interest seems to have been deeper, more philosophical. He was profoundly interested in the concept of active principles in nature, forces that acted at a distance like gravity. He suspected that alchemy, this ancient wisdom, held the key to understanding the hidden, subtle, non-mechanical forces that truly govern the universe, forces that maybe originated directly from God.
And his notes show he was focused on specific alchemical recipes.
Very much so. His manuscripts are filled with meticulous, hand-copied recipes and commentaries, particularly concerning the preparation of something called philosophic mercury, or sometimes sophic mercury.
Philosophic mercury. We touched on this. It wasn't just regular mercury, right?
No, definitely not the element quicksilver. Philosophic mercury was this legendary, highly sought-after substance, a key intermediate in many alchemical processes. It was conceived as a kind of universal solvent, but more than that, a living, metallic water, the pure essence of philosophical mercury itself.
What was it supposed to do?
It was believed to be the agent that could penetrate metals, gently dissolve them back into their prima materia without violence or corrosion, allowing them to be perfectly restructured. It was seen as the key to unlocking the seed within metals, enabling true transmutation. Newton seems to have believed that if he could prepare this sophic mercury, he could unlock the secrets of matter's transformations and maybe even the active principles driving the cosmos.
This really highlights how messy that transition period, the 17th century, actually was. The scientific revolution wasn't some clean break. It was more like a a gradual separation, maybe even a deliberate branding of knowledge.
That's a good way to put it. The public face of science was changing rapidly. Figures like Robert Boyle, who himself was deeply interested in alchemy and even claimed to have witnessed transmutation, publicly championed a mechanical, corpuscular philosophy in works like The Skeptical Chemist.
So Boyle was publicly skeptical, but privately still interested.
It seems so. The rise of scientific societies like the Royal Society in London created pressure for a more rational, mechanistic, publicly demonstrable form of knowledge. Alchemy, with its secretiveness, its mystical language, its reliance on ancient authority, it just didn't fit the new model. It became professionally, socially unacceptable for a natural philosopher to be openly pursuing it.
Which is why Newton had to keep his work secret, and why Boyle's friends allegedly destroyed his alchemical papers after his death.
Exactly. They were trying to protect his reputation, to present him as a pure, rational scientist, untainted by the irrationality of alchemy. Even though, for Boyle and Newton, the pursuit of alchemical knowledge was part of their scientific investigation of nature, they were using empirical methods to test ancient wisdom.
So Newton wasn't really the first modern scientist in a clean sense. Maybe he's better described
as the last of the great alchemists, or perhaps the last of the magicians. Many historians argue that description fits him better. He stood with one foot firmly planted in the ancient Hermetic tradition, trying to decipher God's hidden language in nature while simultaneously using the tools of mathematics and experiment that would define the new science. He was trying to bridge those two worlds, perhaps for the last time.
Okay, so Newton represents this fascinating hidden continuation. But publicly, the tide had turned. Robert Boyle's book, The Skeptical Chemist, published in 1661, seems like a major turning point in discrediting alchemy's core ideas.
It really was a landmark work. Boyle launched a powerful, systematic attack on the theoretical foundations of both main camps of ancient and medieval natural philosophy. He argued against Aristotle's four elements: earth, air, fire, water, and also against Paracelsus's tria prima sulfur, mercury, salt.
Why did he reject them?
His argument was fundamentally empirical. He said, look, nobody has ever reliably broken down substances into these supposed fundamental elements or principles in the laboratory, nor have they reliably synthesized substances from them. They couldn't be demonstrated through experiment. Therefore, he argued, they were just philosophical speculations, not useful scientific concepts.
And instead, he proposed a new definition of a chemical element.
Yes, a definition based purely on laboratory observation and operational definition. Boyle essentially defined an element as a substance that could not be broken down into any simpler substances by chemical means. If you couldn't decompose it further in the lab, then for all practical purposes, it was an element.
That's basically the definition we still use today, isn't it?
It is. It shifted the focus from hidden essences and philosophical principles to observable, measurable properties and reactions. This empirical, mechanistic approach effectively sidelined the grand theoretical claims of transmutation in the public scientific discourse. Alchemy, as a philosophical system, was relegated to the fringes, dismissed as pseudoscience. Its practical, esoteric side, however, lived on.
Right, and this is the great irony, isn't it? While Boyle and others dismantled the theory of alchemy, the new science of chemistry was built almost entirely on the practical achievements of the alchemists over centuries.
Absolutely. The centuries spent chasing the stone, however misguided the ultimate goal might seem now, resulted in an incredible accumulation of practical chemical knowledge and technology. Chemistry didn't spring out of nowhere. It inherited directly from alchemy.
What kind of inheritance are we talking about?
Well, first, the foundational laboratory techniques. Alchemists invented or refined almost all the core processes still used in chemistry labs today: distillation, sublimation, crystallization, filtration, calcination, evaporation, extraction.
And the equipment, too.
Yes, they designed and perfected essential pieces of apparatus: the alembic for distillation, the retort, various types of furnaces and heating baths, crucibles for high-temperature reactions, beakers, flasks. The basic toolkit of the chemist.
Plus, they actually discovered quite a few important substances along the way.
An impressive list. We mentioned the Chinese discovery of gunpowder. Islamic alchemists isolated strong mineral acids like nitric and sulfuric acid. European alchemists, often while searching for the stone or related substances, isolated and characterized elements like antimony, arsenic, bismuth, zinc, phosphorus. These weren't trivial discoveries. They were essential building blocks for future chemical understanding.
So the practical hands-on part of the alchemical quest was actually incredibly successful. It just got rebranded as chemistry.
That's a fair summary. The exoteric legacy, the practical craft, was absorbed and became the foundation of modern chemistry. And Paracelsus's branch, iatrochemistry, directly led to the development of pharmacology and the modern pharmaceutical industry. The stone's quest yielded real, tangible results, even if they weren't the ones originally intended.
Meanwhile, the other half, the esoteric, spiritual, symbolic side.
That side went underground. It was publicly discredited by the rise of mechanism, but it persisted in mystical circles, secret societies, and in those cryptic allegorical texts waiting to be rediscovered.
And that rediscovery happened spectacularly in the 20th century with the psychologist Carl Jung. He dives into these obscure symbolic alchemical texts that mainstream science had ignored for centuries.
Yes, Jung's engagement with alchemy is one of the most fascinating turns in this whole story. He encountered these strange allegorical texts and images like the Mutus Liber we discussed, and had this profound realization. He recognized they weren't just records of bad, failed chemistry.
What did he see them as?
He saw them as something much more significant. Because alchemists often worked in isolation for years, obsessively focused on the transformations happening in their sealed vessels, Jung believed they were unconsciously projecting their own inner psychic processes onto the matter. The cryptic symbols, the bizarre allegories, the stages of the work. He saw it all as a symbolic language describing the unconscious processes of the human psyche.
So the magnum opus, the great work to create the stone, was actually a map of psychological transformation.
That was Jung's great insight. He argued that the entire alchemical quest was a perfect historical analog, a symbolic blueprint for what he considered the central task of human psychological development, the individuation process.
Individuation, that's the journey towards becoming a whole integrated self.
Exactly. The process of integrating the conscious and unconscious parts of the personality, reconciling the opposites within oneself, and ultimately achieving psychic wholeness, which Jung called the realization of the self, with a capital S. He found that the stages and symbols described by the alchemists provided an incredibly precise and detailed map for this inner journey.
Can we map those alchemical stages, nigredo, albedo, rubedo, onto Jung's psychological model? Let's start with that difficult first stage, nigredo, the blackening.
Jung directly equated nigredo with the confrontation with the shadow. The shadow, in Jungian terms, represents the dark, unacknowledged, repressed parts of our personality, our flaws, our unacceptable desires, our hidden potentials. Confronting the shadow is often painful, initiated by crisis, and involves a dissolution of the conscious ego, a descent into psychic chaos. It's that necessary first step of solve, breaking down the old structures, often called shadow work.
Okay, so after confronting the darkness of the shadow in nigredo comes albedo, the whitening, the purification.
Jung saw albedo as representing the crucial stage of integrating the anima, the unconscious feminine principle in men, and the animus, the unconscious masculine principle in women. This involves becoming aware of and integrating these contrasexual aspects of the psyche. It's about achieving a balance between conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine energies within oneself. This corresponds to the sacred marriage, or connutio, often depicted in alchemical texts, the successful union of purified opposites.
And the intermediate stage, citronitis, the yellowing. Did Jung have an interpretation for that?
He did. While it was often condensed later, Jung saw citronitis as representing the emergence of wisdom, the dawning of a new solar consciousness resulting from the successful integration achieved in albedo. He sometimes linked it to the archetype of the wise old man or wise old woman, the appearance of objective insight and guidance from the unconscious.
And finally, the culmination, rubedo, the reddening.
Rubedo, for Jung, symbolized the final achievement, the realization of the integrated self. This isn't just ego consciousness, but a larger, more complete psychic wholeness that transcends the opposites. It represents the fully individuated person, living in harmony with both their conscious and unconscious nature, a state of balance, vitality, and completeness.
So Jung essentially resurrected the esoteric side of alchemy, giving it a modern psychological relevance.
He absolutely did. He transformed it from what looked like a failed attempt at chemistry into a sophisticated, practical guide for personal growth and self-understanding. The goal in this modern psychological interpretation isn't literal gold, but freeing the spiritual self, the inner gold that is obscured or trapped by the unrefined parts of the ego, the inner lead. Hashtag 3.5 the stone in modern culture.
It's really striking how this ancient duality of the stone, the literal physical interpretation versus the symbolic metaphorical one, continues to play out right into our modern popular culture. You can see it perfectly in two huge, very different examples.
You really can. On the one hand, you have the ultimate literal depiction in J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, or Sorcerer's Stone in the U.S.
Right. In Harry Potter, the stone is unambiguously a real physical object.
Absolutely. It's a tangible thing created by Nicholas Flamel, and it does exactly what the classic legends claimed. It produces the elixir of life, granting literal immortality, and it can turn any metal into pure gold.
And Rowling even incorporates the historical legend, making Nicholas Flamel a character who is 665 years old thanks to the elixir. The whole plot revolves around the physical stone and the quest to either protect it or possess it for its literal powers.
It's a perfect modern embodiment of that exoteric, literal interpretation of the alchemical promise.
Then, on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you have Paulo Coelho's novel, The Alchemist.
Yes, a hugely influential book. And while the physical philosopher's stone is mentioned in Coelho's story, its primary function is overwhelmingly symbolic, metaphorical.
Coelho seems to be explicitly rejecting the literal quest for gold and immortality, right?
He is. The central message of the book is that the true masterwork, the real philosopher's stone, isn't some external object you find. It's the internal process of purifying your own heart, understanding the language of the world, and fulfilling your unique purpose in life, what he calls your personal legend.
The treasure is the journey itself and the self-knowledge gained.
Exactly. The book even directly addresses the historical difficulty alchemists had, suggesting the real secret was simple, but men began to reject simple things and sought complex formulas instead. It emphasizes that the ultimate value lies in the inner transformation, the spiritual wisdom acquired, not in material gain. It's a perfect modern expression of the esoteric, symbolic interpretation of alchemy.
What an incredible journey we've taken. We've followed the philosopher's stone from, possibly practical dyeing techniques in Greco-Roman Egypt through the intense experimental rigor of the Islamic Golden Age.
To sparking a revolution in medicine with Paracelsus, secretly captivating the mind of Isaac Newton, the giant of the scientific revolution.
And then, centuries later, re-emerging as this profound psychological map in the work of Carl Jung. It's covered so much ground.
It really highlights what I think is the true enduring power of the stone idea. Its incredible conceptual flexibility. The concept itself was like the ultimate transformer. It adapted, it morphed, it took on the highest intellectual, spiritual, and even practical aspirations of whatever age or culture was engaging with it.
So it survived being debunked by science because its meaning was never solely scientific.
Precisely. It could be chemistry, it could be medicine, it could be mysticism, it could be psychology. It existed in the way that the seeker needed it to exist. It served as this ultimate vessel for human aspiration, whether that aspiration was for infinite wealth, perfect health, divine knowledge, or psychological integration.
So the question the alchemists always wrestled with, is it real? Does it exist? Maybe the answer is yes, but not necessarily as a physical lump of red powder. It's real as a concept, as a symbol, as a driving force.
I think that's a very good way to look at it. The real magic, perhaps, was never its supposed literal power to make gold. The true value, the thing that kept people striving for millennia, seems to lie in the process itself. That solve et coagula.
Dissolve and coagulate.
That fundamental drive to take something unrefined, whether it's lead or crude chemicals, or maybe just your own unexamined life, and through discipline, through struggle, through confronting chaos, break it down, purify it, and reforge it into something more ordered, more integrated, more golden.
So if the heart of the great work is really about finding that prima materia, that formless, ubiquitous stuff, hiding in plain sight, and then transforming it, that leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener, to maybe ponder.
Where might you find your own prima materia today? What is the base metal in your own life, that common, perhaps unexamined raw material that is calling out for transformation? What needs to be dissolved, purified, and remade into your own personal goal?